Okay, lovely. Well, lovely to see you all. And again, welcome to post midterm. So, what I want to do today is basically five things. The first one's very quick. It is going to be just a quick and dirty overview of what we're going to talk about in the second half of this course. So, that's going to take us maybe, let's call it 5 minutes, maybe 10 at the very 5 minutes. And then the rest of the session is going to be focusing on effectively questions about ontology and ontological commitment. So what we'll do is we'll start off by talking about the general idea of ontological commitment, why it's an interesting kind of question, why philosophers get involved in these kinds of things. We'll talk then about some kind of misleading issues about language and proto-paraphrasing. So this will have a little segue with Alice in Wonderland. Then we'll talk about Quine's method for understanding ontological commitment. I'll give you a couple example cases. So we'll walk through three particular example cases, one of which is actually something I'm really interested in. And then we'll finish off at the very end by talking about two kind of issues with this method that Quine's given us for testing ontological commitment. So that's basically the plan. Again, I want to start by giving you a kind of overview and motivation for the second half of the course. So the first half of the course was entirely about, effectively, formal logic, right? Teaching you the machinery, teaching you how to use the machinery, really just making sure that you're kind of logic conversant. The second half here is, in some sense, about the philosophy of logic. Slightly more directly, what this is going to be about is a bunch of different topics that fall in this overlap between logic, analytic metaphysics, and analytic philosophy of language. And the reason that it's kind of in the overlap here is because, quite frankly, it's very hard to pull these apart. In fact, I think one of the things that will come out today is just how interrelated questions about logic, language, and metaphysics turn out to be. So in this way, yeah, the kind of main aim for the second half here is it's going to be to extend and apply some of the formal tools that we developed in the first half. In particular, it's going to be more on the extend part. We're going to use a lot of the stuff that we learned, but not in the like, hey, let's build some interpretations or build me a table. We won't do any more of that, I promise. No more of the pain. It will be something different. Instead, what we're going to do is think about what happens when you start doing philosophy with the formal tools that we had, right, that we developed in the first half. And in this way, it's going to, in some sense, be really looking at philosophical upshots of our formal tools. So one of the things we're really going to focus on is developing and extending first-order logic. And this is really because, and I think we talked about this right at the end of lecture 6, FOL is often, or what we've learned as FOL, is often called classical logic. The presupposition that there's no gaps, that there's no gluts, and that we can treat almost everything with this sort of term-predicate method with the two quantifiers. This is the way that when people learn logic, that's almost always what they mean, is FOL. And FOL is a better tool in many ways than TFL because of the increase in expressive power. We can say things with FOL that we can't with truth functional logic. And one of the really cool things is that because we gain this expressive power, we actually gain a lot of new kind of philosophical import or potential ranges of applications. Even still, it's limited. And actually, one of the things we'll talk about in the second half is a limitation. So this is kind of the working aim and a slight motivation for why we're going to focus broadly on stuff relating to FOL. So what exactly are we going to do? Well, today we're going to talk about ontology and quantification. So this is really going to be focused on this idea of ontological commitment and the underlying issue of what is there, or what is ontology. So the thought here is going to be, hey, it looks like we could use FOL to help us characterize this big, slightly amorphous project of figuring out what there is, or at least what there is according to a theory. So that's what we're going to do today. Then next week, what we're going to do is kind of extend our formal toolkit by talking about sets. So have people done any kind of set theory or anything like this before? That's kind of what I expected. So set theory is often taken to be the foundation of mathematics, or at least that's the hope, right? You could understand all of mathematics in terms of it. Don't worry, it's not going to be any maths. Right? What I really want to do here is introduce some notation to you, introduce some fundamental concepts, because you might run into these kinds of things later in life. I basically want to set you up so that if you're reading a paper later and you see these weird little squiggly things, or it's talking about like the reflexive closure of this set, you'd be like, oh, thank God Nathan told me what that means, right? That's the aim. Right? And along with basic set theory, I'm going to teach you some things about properties of relations. So we talked about relations, right? Two-place or multi-place predicates before, but there's also some important properties that relations have. So I want to introduce you to those again, so that when you come across this sort of talk later in life, and by life I mean later in the next few years when you're doing more philosophy, you'd be like, oh, I know what a reflexive relation is. Between friends, the reason we're covering a lot of this stuff in the second half of this course is because we were getting a bunch of students rocking up to like second and third year philosophy of mind courses, which were using some terminology, and people were like, I have never heard of this before in my life. So I had to give up my sweet, sweet natural deduction to do this. But that's okay. This is fun too. So then the third week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about possibility and necessity, how things could be and how they must be. And this is an interesting topic because FOL looks like it's poised to capture this, but it actually can't. But there's a very simple and easy way to extend first-order logic to allow for us to talk about how things could be and how they must be. That's what we'll talk about in 3 weeks. So again, this first kind of block of things is an initial application of first-order logic, and then 2 ways we can kind of extend our formal toolkit. The back trio is kind of similar. So first, what we're going to do is talk about the nature of properties. Obviously, when we did things like interpretations, I told you the fundamental thing here is the extensions of predicates. Right? What are the predicates true of? Well, you might also wonder, cool, what the hell is a predicate? What does it stand for? What's the meaning of it in some deeper sense? And the idea here is very Platonic. Right? Is there something like a universal that's out there? Another way to come at it is, right, the color of this and the color of this look to be the same. So is there something that is literally shared between these two things? Is there something that is the color gray that both of these are? So that's the kind of idea that we'll talk about there. And again, this is extending our FOL talk. Instead of now just having terms for material objects or objects more generally, to allow predicates to be kinds of terms as well. Terms for universals, for properties. Then the fifth topic we're going to do is about reference. How is it that proper names work? How is it that the name Nathan connects to this object? Is it via just kind of label, or is it some kind of hidden descriptor? And finally, our last topic is going to come back to something I promised that we'd come to, understanding the identity relation. What does it mean to say that A equals B is true, or A is identical to B? What does this tell us? What's the relationship between identity and indiscernibility? That is, sharing all and only the same properties. And finally, is identity something that an object and the things that make it up have to stand in, or are there reasons to think there's some other relationship here? So that's going to be the plan. In all of this, what we're going to constantly be coming back to are the various tools and notions that we developed in first order logic. But we're not going to explicitly use the machinery. It's always going to be kind of applying it in some way, applying the concepts that we developed. Cool? Questions before we get going? Does the broad idea make sense? Again, a lot of it is sort of, I don't know what's going to happen. So it'll be fair when we get there, right? Should also stress that the format is going to change a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. Right? So what I mean by that is, basically the lectures are still going to work roughly the same, but since this is more philosophy than just brute logic, I want a little, I expect, I hope, maybe that's the better word here, I hope there'll be a little bit more discussion, but also a lot of this I still understand is going to be mostly me delivering content to you. And in that way, I always feel a bit like a YouTuber up here, right? It's just, I'm a content delivery mechanism. Right. But of course, right, we're actually kind of, there's more philosophy stuff. There's more room for us to have debates, as it were, rather than just like, here's how the fucking tables work, right? So I should also stress the tutorials will kind of stay the same, though slightly shift in focus. We don't have a textbook to work with. Instead, what we're going to do is work through kind of response questions. These are going to be broadly short answer questions of the same type that I will ask you on the final exam. So in that sense, it works the same, and the tutorials will be preparing you for the exam by working through the exact kind of questions, but they're not going to be just like, draw me a table. They'll be, cool, what's Quine's method? What are some problems with it? That kind of stuff. Make sense? Nice. Also, some more details about the final exam later in the semester, so I'll let you know probably in a couple weeks' time exactly what the format's going to be. Roughly speaking, it's going to be something like 10 questions, some of which will be definitions, some of which will be short answer. You can pick, I think, 4 out of the 10. But we'll talk about that when we get a little closer. Okay. That's the overview. Let's do some actual content. Let's talk about commitment, please. Yeah, good. So actually, this is useful. I can just show you. If you go to assignments and you look at like the homework for lecture 9, it has some these questions. So these are, again, stuff directly tied either to the reading or the things that we'll talk about. And really, let me stress, for these, you don't need to write like a 1,000-word essay, right? A couple paragraphs at most will often do the job. Right? So all of the questions are already there. They're in the assignment thing, so if you just click on the assignment little tab, I guess, link, whatever, it'll take you to this, and you can type your answers in, or you can type them in a paper and then paste that, whatever you want to do. It's fine. Cool. Good practical question. Anything else before we press on? Nice. Okay. So let's go back. Beautiful. So, commitment issues. So when we were doing FOL, right, a lot of times, especially when we were doing FOL symbolization, right, you would be given a domain. Now, a lot of times, right, you were given an explicit domain. It would say, okay, it's going to be Igmar and Haftor, and that's it. Or, hey, it's people. Or, hey, it's people in anime, for some really jokey examples, right? Now, notably, when we're given a domain, this is the things that we're talking about. And being told the content of the domain was really useful because, well, this told us what we needed to think about in the extensions of the predicates, right? It fixed what could be picked up by the relevant names. And it also, in some ways, kind of the most important thing, settled what was ranged over by the quantifiers. Again, if we're thinking about the quantifiers in this kind of like grabber machine metaphor, right? Basically, the stuff that's in the domain is the stuff in the box that our quantifiers could grab. But of course, there were occasions when you weren't given a domain. Right? For example, when I asked you to build some interpretations, right? I would ask for you to fix your own domains. But that's not the only kind of way that you might not be given a domain, right? In particular, it might be such that you could work backwards. In fact, we kind of did this, if you think about it. When I was asking you for example, I gave you a sentence and I said, show me that this sentence is not a contradiction. What did you do? Well, you built an interpretation that had a domain to make this sentence true. Right? You get a domain and then you fix the predicate extension such that the sentence came out true. Cool, you worked backwards. And this is very interesting because it seems like we could do this more generally. You could take some sentences that you want to be true and then work backwards to figure out what the domain is or what it should be in order for the sentences to be true. Do we see the basic thought process here? Right? So we've got some sentences, some claims. We want these claims to come out true. All right, let's reverse engineer what the world, the domain, needs to be in order for these sentences to come out true. Basically, what we're going to do is that just in slightly more stronger explicit terms. Coin's method is that. So what's neat is that this suggests that we can sometimes go from sentences to things like the domain. The structure of the sentences we're looking at help us figure out what's out there according to these sentences. So that's the first kind of interesting issue that we might be focused on. A second related but distinct issue is that sometimes when we're given a scientific, philosophical, mathematical, geometrical, whatever theory, we can be interested in sorting out what the theory is committed to. What does the theory say that there is? What does the theory say the world has to be like? What does the theory say is out there? Right? Another way to ask the same question, what things must exist for the theory to be true? Or to put it in terms that we'll talk about, right? What are the ontological commitments of the theory? So the idea here with ontological commitment, right? Ontology, I expect you've come across this word already in your metaphysics class. Right? So again, ontology, something like the study of being, the study of what there is, what exists. Right? So ontological commitments are going to be the things that a theory says exist. What does the theory have to have in order to be true? So here's a cheap in theory example. Yeah, please.
Sorry, what did you say ontological was?
Good. So the idea of ontological commitment is what things does the theory commit to their being? What does the theory say has to exist? Again, we can kind of draw this out with some examples, please.
So that's not like reality?
Yeah.
It has to be reality.
Well, so importantly, what we're after here is we're thinking purely in terms of we've got a theory, and we want to know what does the theory say is out there, right? Or what must be out there for the theory to be true. There's a further question of, cool, is it there?
Yeah.
We're not really going that far, right? Because then we have to get out of our armchairs, right? The same basic idea about why we're interested in logic, formal logic, applies here. We don't necessarily need to go out and do some empirical work to see if the commitments are actually satisfied. We just want to know, hey, what does this need? What does it say exists? Then we can figure out if it's true or not.
And we're talking about proclamation.
Good. So this is something that is kind of unclear yet, right? All we're really, when we're thinking about the ontological commitments, is what things need to be in the domain. We haven't given you anything like a method yet. So it might be via names, it might be via something else. I'm going to talk more about exactly how we do it. But again, we can kind of draw this idea out from a few examples. Here's a cheap and theory one. Right? Plate tectonic theory. Right? Again, I like geology. It's kind of fun, right? So you have mountains. There are volcanoes that occasionally erupt and occasionally go dormant. There are earthquakes all the time. there's this weird kind of mountain range around the Pacific Ocean where there's a big fucking hole in the middle, right? Cool, let's try and explain that phenomenon, right? Well, here's an explanation. We'll postulate that the Earth's outermost layer is made up of big rocky plates that sit on a molten layer and move around. And earthquakes can come from those plates moving or bumping into each other. Mountains come when one plate kind of goes up on top of one of the other plates. Why is there a big hole in the middle of the Pacific? Because the plates are moving apart there, and it's just leaving a big hole. Right? So again, what's this theory doing? It's designed to explain a bunch of empirical phenomenon, in this case, geological phenomenon in this case, right? And it does so by postulating the existence of plates, tectonic plates. So what is this theory ontologically committed to? Well, it's committed to a few things. Mountain ranges, volcanoes, a molten layer, right? This sort of asthenosphere, right? We need the lithosphere, we need the plates. It's committed to the Earth. There's a bunch of things that this theory says are out there that need to exist if this theory is true. So the commitments of this theory are these things, the things that the theory says exist. Yeah.
So do you mean this, as I said, this example of that a plate tectonic theory needs to be attached to some ontological entities, which are plates and these kind of things, to be true?
Exactly, right? So we're not necessarily saying it is true, right? Probably is, right? But again, what we're really interested in is figuring out what kind of things does the theory require exist in order to be true.
So you could also do this with like people, flat earthers?
Yeah. Flat Earth theory has a bunch of ontological commitments, right? It says these are the things that exist, these are the things that don't exist, right? Again, when we think about checking the ontological commitments of a theory, we're just saying, what does the theory require? What does the theory say is out there? Yeah.
These are all physical objects. And what happens if you start to talk about abstract objects?
Cool. We're going to get to that in just a second. Importantly, in every case, the general idea, it applies across the board. Right? This is just an opening example. Let's talk about, I got two more examples for you. Yeah.
So ontological commitment postulates on what has to exist for the theory to be true.
Good. So it says, right, the ontological commitments of a theory are what things the theories say must exist. The theory says exist, what has to be out there for the theory to be true. I'll give you a slightly neater definition, I think, in a couple slides. So again, here's our first example. Here's a second example. There is Vulcan. Are people familiar with this example? Does this come up in philosophy of science at all? So this is a wonderful one. Right? So Mercury has some weird movements, or apparent weird movements in the way it orbits the sun. Right? Viewed from Earth, it seems to do this kind of like wiggle occasionally when it's going on its otherwise good orbit. So, cool, we want to explain, why does it do the wiggle? Why does it not behave the way we expect it to? Well, Barrier comes along and he says, okay, here's the explanation. There's actually a planet in between Mercury and the sun. Let's call it Vulcan. Vulcan because, he's the god of the forge, right? So he doesn't mind being stuck right next to the sun. And Vulcan, the weight of Vulcan, the mass of Vulcan, impacts Mercury's orbit, and that explains why it moves the way it does. So Vulcan was postulated to explain this phenomenon. Now, this theory is ontologically committed to planets, the sun, Mercury, and Vulcan. And this is why we know this theory is false. Because there is no Vulcan. There is no planet in between Mercury and the sun. So the commitments of the theory include something that we know isn't there, so we know that the theory is false. So this brings up some questions I think people were after, right? The commitments, the ontological commitments of the theory are what does it say exist? There's a further question then of, are these things out there? So again, and this is a physical example, but we don't have to concern ourselves just with physical objects. But this is a nice contrast with the plate tectonics one, because this seems not just that there are commitments to plates, but plates are there, plausibly. Whereas in this case, there was a commitment to Vulcan, and then we just didn't find it. That's why we knew the theory's false.
Could you please repeat the definition of ontological commitment so I can relate it to
Yeah, so again, the commitments, the ontological commitments of the theory are what have to be there for the theory to be true. Like what entities need to exist. And in this case, since Vulcan doesn't exist, it is not, the theory ain't true.
Could you in a way see them as premises?
In some sense,
So
right?
They have to be true. So premises that have to be true in order for the theory to be true.
So importantly, in this case, the reason why, yes, in a way, but importantly, we don't want to think about them as premises, because premises are just more sentences, right? In this case, what we want to think about is what needs to be in the domain, right? This is tying it back to the FOL stuff. What has to be in the domain? Vulcan better be in there. If Vulcan ain't in there, then the theory about this ain't true. Because every time we say Vulcan's a planet, no, it ain't in the extension of planets, my dude. Yeah.
So to give an answer in the case of this, for example, we could select the ontological commitments of the various Vulcana. No. Isn't it? Like,
Yes.
it would be a good answer. Okay.
So basically what we do is we draw out all of the things that this theory says, hey, these are out there and it's like this. Again, we're kind of playing around with the initial idea. I haven't given you a method for laying them out yet, right? But I want to get the basic idea. Yeah.
So these things can be physical things like sun, Vulcan, which is assumed to be physical, a pen or Danik or something, but they can also be non-physical things like life, soul, green, a color. Like
Sure.
the concept of green, is that also?
I was going to talk about blue, but yes, that would be a commitment, right? So here's an argument for the existence of what are often called Platonic universals, which are taken to be abstract objects. Right? So we'll say, okay, look at my pile of cups here. Let's take the one that's, not the top, but just one down. We'll call it top, just because I couldn't think of a better name. Right? So this one. Right? We'll call that top, and we'll call that one bottom for obvious reasons, right? It seems pretty clear that top is true. Or sorry, top is blue. And it seems pretty clear that bottom is blue. So very plausibly, you would say there's something that top is that bottom is too. What's that thing? It's blue. So it looks like we should think that blue exists. Being blue is something out there that these things share, as does your sweater and your shirt and da 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 da. Right? Blueness is a thing. Again, the idea here is we don't necessarily have to think that this is true, just that this kind of idea is going to be committed to the existence of blue.
So an entity can be a conceptual entity.
Mm-hmm. It just needs to be an entity. Right? It's got to be something that we can feed into our domain. It could be a number, it could be a physical object, it could be an abstract object, it can be an idea. Do not care. If it is something that we can give a proper name to, more money in the bank.
But it can also be more than one thing, because this one is blue and a cup.
So importantly, what we have there is probably there's at least two things that these things share. Being a cup. Cupness, let's call it, and blueness. Right? But importantly, whatever one we think it is, there's something that both of them are. Maybe we don't know yet. We can call it Steve. There's Steve that's shared. What is it like? Well, did you mean like having a handle? Did you mean being a cup? Did you mean blue? Say more about Steve. But all that matters is this thing is committed to whatever the hell Steve is.
So
So there's a difference because you said blueness has to exist, and it's not just the predicate that something is blue. So is that difference with FRL?
Yeah.
The
Yes.
predicates aren't included in the domain.
Yes. So importantly, though, it's very important that we phrase the last claim the way that we do. There is something that top is, that bottom is too. And by saying there is something, right? How do we understand there is something? What do we use to express that? You remember? It's the extension, right? And what is the existential? It doesn't have a big letter attached to it, it has a lowercase letter. So it's treating blueness as not as a predicate, but as a kind of object.
But how do we change that into a predicate? Because we're not saying this cup is blueness is exactly the same as the cup.
We'll come back to this when we talk about properties. Right? This is a big issue with this kind of view. Right? This is a big issue with any kind of view that treats properties as some kind of object. And between friends, there's not really a good answer. But for our purposes right now, it doesn't really matter. All that matters is, again, we get the idea of this ontological commitment. That the way that this is phrased, it's committed to there being something that's shared. Blueness, cupness, whatever we care, right? Having a handleness. Yeah.
Could you also apply existence to it?
Yeah. It's an interesting question, right? So existence looks like it should be yet more grist to this mill. Because obviously we want to say that both of these things exist according to our cup theory. So, interesting. We'll come back to that in, I think, just a slide or two. Again, we get this process about what ontological commitments of a theory are. I haven't really given you a method yet, but I just want to see, we get the idea. What does the theory say exist? What has to be there for the theory to be true? So this ties in with a much broader issue, another project we might be interested in, right? So our first project that we talked about was, let's figure out domains. The second project, slightly more substantive, was figuring out what are theories committed to? What are the ontological commitments of theories? The third project, the big one, is let's just do ontology, right? What is there? What stuff exists? What's out there in the world, right? And just putting it really bluntly, ontology is a mess, right? Doing it is really, really hard. And that's in part because, quite frankly, there's no generally accepted way to settle ontological questions. Or similarly, there's probably not even, well, there is no generally accepted way of knowing what questions are even being asked. But I want to give you one way of coming at this project. And it's going to be related to thinking about the ontological commitments of a theory. So, one way to understand the ontological project, we just ask, what is there out in the world, is by thinking about the ontological commitments of the theory. Right? That is, what are the ontological commitments of the perfect, complete, entirely accurate theory of the world? So you'll sometimes see this metaphor of writing the book of the world. So we might ask, right, let's suppose that our theory is written in the book of the world. Cool, what are its ontological commitments? Well, if we knew the ontological commitments of the perfect theory, we would know what there is. Because the ontological commitments of the theory are the things that are there for it to be true, and the perfect theory is the one that perfectly accurately describes the world. So the commitments of this perfect theory are just the stuff that's there. And it wouldn't be anything else. So again, this gives you a way to kind of tie together two very interesting projects. What are theories committed to? And this much broader question of what is there? Yes?
And the problem of trying to make an ontology or ontological problem is related to if we are not able to make some kind of hierarchy or something like this, like Plato does, for example, in this, or where is the conflict point? Like, what's your opinion on this?
Well, so I'm not sure that there's really a problem with anything like a hierarchy, because that's just no relations. We can postulate those. We can say that this depends on that and flesh that out. That's something we're going to talk about that later on in a couple weeks. Right? But I think that the lurking worry here is, how do we figure out when our theory is perfect? Yeah, it looks like we'd already need to know all the answers to know that this is the perfect theory, but then we don't need to do this ontological commitment-y stuff. We've got the answers already. But that's not really our problem. We're just doing our good, sweet, figure out how ontological commitment works.
But for us, it's to debunk that perfect theory, then, right? To see if those commitments are true.
It might be such that we could never know whether we've got the perfect theory or not. Right?
Yeah.
So if you think that kind of Kantian or something like this, and there's just no real access to the way the world really is, cool. But what we could still do is say, hey, I think this is pretty close. Here's what the world's got to be like.
Oh,
That's still pretty good. As a second, not quite, literally spelling out the way the world is, but this is the best theory we've got of the world, and this is what it says the world is like. I'll take that. Yeah.
Can you say that an ontological commitment is something like Santa Claus? Because because you have, for example, something like existence, which can be applied, but is Santa Claus part of existence the same way?
Good.
You could say, because of course the concept of Santa Claus exists, but does that also apply? So
So we got to be careful there. Keep the different things different, right? There's a concept of Santa, and then there's the dude himself. The concept definitely exists. Dude himself?
so
Don't want to break anybody's hearts, right?
So, like say like the theory of Santa. Like say for that to exist, do you need to say the concept of Santa exists and Santa Claus itself exists?
I wouldn't think so.
Or do you need to say Santa Claus itself exists or the concept of Santa Claus exists, depending on what you're going for?
Depending on what you're going for, right? So you could have 3 different ways to cash in, well, 4, I guess, right? So one way is you've just got the concept and no dude. One way is you've got the dude and no concept. One way is you've got both dude and concept. So, easier one, right? Country doesn't exist yet, but we have the concept of making it. Cool. Concept, country does not. Then you bring the country into existence. Concept and entity exist. And then it's a little harder to think about cases where the object exists without the concept, but let's suppose that all the thinking entities die, or maybe even better, never existed at all. Arguably, the plates are still there, doing their tectonic work.
Yes.
So again, we got to be careful here about whether we're talking about the ideas or the entities, the things.
Okay. So when you say like the theory of Santa, there's a man that is a man with beard and a red suit that goes through the chimney and brings you presents. So ontological commitments need to have presents, red suit, beard, man. But does that also entail the concept of Santa?
Not strictly speaking,
Right.
right?
When you say there's a man called Santa, does it have to be the person Santa, or does it have to be the concept of Santa? Because the concept of Santa is what I just said. So
No.
does that
No. So the concept Santa is maybe the thing describing or described by all of those properties or including all of those properties. But the thing that actually has them or would have them would be the man. So again, there's a subtle slide here between something like use and mention. If we want to use this description, the kind of thing that you just laid out, well, if we use it, it's going to try and grab a dude, a man who has a beard and a red suit, distributes presents, and it fails, right? But if you just say like, okay, here's an idea, the idea is going to be described in this kind of way, well, that's no problem. You can do that, it's easy. In fact, arguably just simply stating it is enough to bring it into existence. Again.
To me, there appears to be a difference between countries and Santa, because when you look at the Netherlands, it refers just to a specific geographical area, but Santa Claus doesn't really refer to the Santa Claus, because there There's no man who lives in the North Pole and
Yeah.
flies the sky ranger.
You don't know that.
Yeah. But importantly, again, so don't get caught up in the specific example there, right? So what I was really trying to do was, again, give in examples where we have the difference between concept and object. That was all I was after.
Did you just say if an object or if a concept exists, the object must exist too?
No, definitely not.
Oh, then I
Definitely
think,
not. Because I mean, arguably, we have things like the concept of the round square, and there ain't none of those.
Another way around.
So yeah, I think we could definitely have instances of things that are out there we don't have concepts for. So again, here's a plausible example. Suppose that no thinking entities ever existed. The plates would still be in there doing their tectonic work. Plates exist. Ain't no plate concepts. Ain't no conceivers. Again, we can debate about this. If you don't like that example, you might just think about objects that are so far out of our causal light cone we've never even thought about them. They're there, but we ain't got no ideas about them.
Interesting.
Yeah. Again, but we're getting a little off track. The thing that matters, what I want to get after here, again, is this idea of tracing down the commitments of a theory. What does a theory say exists? What does a theory require? Now, I think one thing that's lurking a little bit in this discussion we're having is we've got to be very careful about language misleading us. So I want to give you an example, and we'll talk quickly about the example, and then how are people feeling? Do we want to take a break, or do we want to keep going? Break? Okay, we'll talk about the example, and then we'll take a break. So here is a few cases where English screws us over. Right? The surface grammar of a natural language sentence often belies underlying logical structure. Here's the easiest one that I think a lot of people will identify with. A only if B, right? How hard was it to remember the logical structure of a sentence that says A only if B? It's so natural to read that as B conditional A. Right? But that's wrong. That's wrong. It's A conditional B. But a slightly more interesting one is this little play on words from Lewis Carroll, right? So Alice is talking to the White King, and the White King asks who's coming down, or who did she see coming down the road? And Alice says, I see nobody on the road. And the king, of course, says, I only wish I had such eyes, to be able to see nobody, and at this distance too. So obviously there's a very cheesy pun here, right? What's happened, effectively, is that the king has read, I see nobody on the road. They've read nobody as a name. They've read it as, hey, it's a name. Another really famous example of the same thing is Odysseus and Polyphemus in the cave in the Odyssey, right? He stabs the Cyclops' eye out after having told him that his name is nobody, right? Or no one, I think technically is the better translation. So then when the other Cyclops come, and the one who's got his eye blinded out, they ask him like, oh, who did this to you? He says, no one did. And they're all like, okay, cool, then I guess we can just go? Did you just do this to yourself? Like, what happened here? It's the same pun, just in reverse. So again, what's happening here is basically the king, for lulz, is misreading the logical structure of Alice's claim. The surface level grammar is ambiguous between, are we taking nobody to be a name? Are we taking it to be something like a quantifier? It's not the case that there is somebody on the road. So natural language can be a mess. Natural language, in and of itself, as we read it, is ambiguous in many different ways. And this can be bad if what we're after is trying to figure out what the commitments of a theory are. Because the theory is going to be made up of a bunch of sentences, probably written in natural language. And then you read it, and it's like, well, crap, what does this say? What is this theory actually trying to tell me? What really are its commitments? So the next move is going to be to try and use some of the tools that we've talked about to help make that clearer. Okay, so let's take a break. We're at 33, so we come back at 45. Sounds good, 12 minutes? Good, okay, cool.